You are the last human species, right now, on this planet, the only one. That is an unusual situation. For most of the last 300,000 years, it was not the case. When Homo sapiens first migrated out of Africa, they were not alone. Europe and Western Asia were occupied by Neanderthals, a species that had been there for 400,000 years. Southeast Asia had Homo erectus. The island of Flores had Homo floresiensis, a small-bodied species that stood about a meter tall. The Philippines had Homo luzonensis. Siberia had the Denisovans, a species we only discovered existed in 2010 from a single finger bone in a cave. By roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, almost all of them were gone. Homo sapiens was the last one standing. The question is, what happened to the others? The most obvious answer, we killed them, is almost certainly part of the truth, but only part. And the part that's missing is the part that should genuinely change how you think about what you are. Before we talk about what happened, we need to talk about who the Neanderthals actually were, because the old picture about dim-witted brutes, simply outmatched by smarter modern humans, is not what the evidence shows. Neanderthal brains were as large as ours, in some specimens, larger. They made sophisticated tools. They cared for their injured and elderly. There are Neanderthal skeletons showing healed injuries that would have required weeks of dependent care to survive. They buried their dead. Evidence suggests they decorated themselves and possibly produced art. They were not cognitively simple creatures encountered by a vastly superior invader. They were people, by any reasonable definition of the word. And approximately 40,000 years ago, shortly after modern humans arrived in Europe in significant numbers, they disappeared. The correlation is stark. Modern humans arrive in a region. Not long after, the Neanderthals in that region are gone. This pattern repeats across their entire geographic range. It is not subtle. But correlation is not causation. So what actually happened? Not one thing, several things, at different times, in different places, all at once. The direct violence hypothesis. Modern humans and Neanderthals met, fought, and modern humans won. The evidence for this is limited and contested. There are Neanderthal skeletal remains showing trauma that some researchers attribute to violence from modern humans. But distinguishing violence caused by modern humans from violence caused by other Neanderthals, from accidents, from post-mortem damage by geological processes, is genuinely difficult. There is no smoking gun, no clear evidence of systematic, large-scale extermination. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Violence between ancient humans leaves ambiguous traces in bone. Large-scale population elimination through violence, happening over thousands of years across a continent, would not necessarily leave obvious concentrated evidence at any specific site. What we can say is this: two groups competing for the same resources in the same landscape will, eventually, come into direct conflict. Not organized war, not genocide in any structured sense, but 10,000 small moments. A territorial boundary crossed, a prey animal contested at a river crossing, a camp raided in a bad winter where the outcome went the wrong way for one species and the right way for the other. Accumulated across thousands of years, in hundreds of valleys. Not a war, a pattern. Modern humans arrived from Africa, carrying pathogens to which they had been exposed for thousands of years. Pathogens to which, through the brutal process of selection, they had developed some degree of resistance. Neanderthals, isolated from these pathogen environments, had no such resistance. The epidemiological dynamics of a disease-naive population encountering novel pathogens are not subtle. The history of European contact with indigenous populations in the Americas, who experienced catastrophic mortality from diseases their visitors brought, diseases that the visitors had adapted to over millennia, is a documented historical parallel. A modern human arriving in Neanderthal territory didn't have to be carrying a weapon to be carrying death. The viruses and bacteria they harbored were potentially far more effective at population elimination than any direct violence could be. And unlike violence, disease leaves essentially no recognizable trace in the fossil record. The Neanderthal who died of an introduced respiratory infection 3 months after contact with a modern human group left bones that look no different from those of a Neanderthal who died of old age. We have no way to count these deaths. We only know that the populations declined, and that the timing lines up. Two species occupying similar ecological niches, using similar resources in the same geographic areas, are in competition, regardless of whether either species understands or intends that competition. Modern humans and Neanderthals both hunted large game, both occupied caves and shelters, both needed the same resources in the same landscapes. But modern humans appear to have had one significant advantage. Their social networks were larger and longer range. The evidence of long-distance trade in materials, shells, and pigments appearing hundreds of kilometers from their origin at modern human sites indicates connections across vast geographic areas. Neanderthal social networks appear to have been smaller and more locally confined. Larger social networks provide two things: information, knowing where resources are across a wider area; resilience, being able to call on support from distant groups in lean times. Two groups, same valley, same prey. A bad winter, less food than either group needs. One group has contacts in valleys 3 days away who told them where the herds move in early autumn. The other group doesn't have that information. In a good year, it doesn't matter. In a bad year, it's the difference between eating and not eating. And the bad years, with climate oscillating, came regularly. This is competitive exclusion, the ecological principle that two species competing for the same niche cannot stably coexist. One will eventually eliminate the other through attrition rather than direct conflict. The modern human didn't need to kill the Neanderthal. The modern human just needed to be slightly better at finding food in the same landscape, consistently over thousands of years. The mathematics of population dynamics do the rest. In 2010, Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. The answer it contained changed everything. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today carries approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Not as a distant trace, as a measurable, functionally significant percentage, in your cells, right now. People of Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian ancestry carry an additional 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA from a separate archaic human species discovered from a single finger bone in a Siberian cave. These are not contamination signals. They are functional genetic contributions. Some Neanderthal-derived genes are in your immune system. They may have given us disease resistance built up over 400,000 years of European exposure that we hadn't had time to develop ourselves. The Denisovans gave high-altitude populations something else. A gene variant associated with adaptation to thin air found in Tibetan peoples appears to be Denisovan in origin. Every person who runs at high altitude is in a small but real sense running partly on Denisovan biology. We were competing with Neanderthals. We were carrying disease into their populations. And we were also having children with them, at the same time, possibly in the same communities. Groups that are engaged in systematic extermination do not also produce viable offspring together. At minimum, the relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals included periods of contact that were not uniformly hostile. The extinction was not clean. Here's the part that makes the question, did we kill them, harder to answer than it looks. Because the Neanderthals aren't entirely gone. The genes got through. Whatever the social circumstances of those encounters, whether consensual, whether violent, whether the product of long coexistence or brief contact between strangers, the genes got through. The offspring survived, found mates, passed their genes forward for 30,000 generations until they appear in your cells today. And here's what should unsettle you about that. The interbreeding was not rare. It happened multiple times in multiple places over tens of thousands of years of contact. The boundary between modern humans and Neanderthals was permeable in both directions. We didn't encounter Neanderthals across a clear line with us on one side and them on the other. We lived alongside them, in the same valleys, for thousands of years, sometimes in conflict, sometimes not. And the result of that encounter is not a clean elimination. It is a dissolution. A small piece of every Neanderthal who ever contributed to those encounters is still here, in you, doing things, working. You're back at that map, one species, just us. But now you know what just us actually means. It means the result of thousands of years of contact, competition, disease, violence, and interbreeding between multiple lineages of beings who all made tools and buried their dead, and cared for their injured, and possibly looked at the same stars and wondered about the same things. The most accurate answer the evidence allows is that modern humans were probably involved in the disappearance of the other species. Through disease they didn't know they were carrying. Through competition they didn't know they were winning. Through violence that was episodic, not organized. And through interbreeding that blurred the boundary between them and us until them and us stopped being clean categories. There is a version of this story that is comfortable. Natural competition. No moral weight. Just one species outperforming another. There is a version that is not comfortable. A version in which beings who made tools, cared for their sick, buried their dead, and possibly made music are gone. And we are here. And the relationship between those two facts is the most uncomfortable question in the entire history of our species. The science can tell you what probably happened. It cannot tell you how to feel about it. We didn't replace the Neanderthals, we absorbed them, outcompeted them, and outlasted them, often at the same time, sometimes in the same valley, occasionally in the same bed. The line between us and them was never as clear as we made it sound, and a small piece of every Neanderthal who ever lived still exists in you.